The letter arrived on a Tuesday. 3 paragraphs. Club letterhead. The Hells Angels logo printed in black and red at the top. The same logo Wade Briggs had bled for, ridden for, and in certain dark years done far worse things for. 30 years reduced to 3 paragraphs and a final line. Please surrender your colors within 5 business days. He read it once. Then he set it on the kitchen table of his 1-bedroom apartment above the tattoo parlor in San Bernardino and stared at the wall for 4 hours. The wall held photographs. Him and his brothers at Sturgis in 1989. A group shot outside a bar in Barstow, where the sign behind them read, "Cold beer," and the year was 1994. And every man in that picture had hair back then. A photograph from a run through the Mojave in 2001 12 bikes, stretched across the desert highway like a dark river moving west. He had been 18 years old when the Hells Angels found him. Found is the right word. He was not recruited. He was not persuaded. He was sitting in a dive bar in Oakland with a black eye from his latest fight, with a man who had decided that Wade Briggs was someone who could be pushed around. The Hells Angels told him different. They offered him something he had never had. A family that would not leave. A brotherhood that demanded only loyalty and the willingness to ride straight into hell alongside your brothers. He had given them 30 years. 30 years of wearing the patch with a kind of pride that went bone deep. 30 years of riding when they rode and fighting when they fought and doing the things that do not get written down anywhere. Because writing them down would mean a cell in a federal prison. He had run cargo across state lines in the dead of winter cargo that he knew better than to ask questions about. He had collected debts from men who thought distance and time would protect them. It did not protect them. Wade Briggs was patient, and he had a very good memory. He was not a romantic figure. He was not the noble outlaw of the movies, the misunderstood man with a heart of gold riding towards some beautiful horizon. He was a man who had done hard things for hard people and told himself it was about brotherhood. Sometimes that was even true. The end came because of a 25-year-old in designer jeans who used the word synergy without embarrassment. The chapter president had invited an entrepreneur to their meeting in Riverside, a man who wanted to use the Hells Angels name to sell energy drinks. He spoke about demographic targeting and brand alignment. He wore a watch that cost more than Wade's motorcycle. Wade had asked one question. He asked whether the men who bled to build that name would see $1 of that money. 3 days later came the letter. He packed everything into a single duffel bag. It took 40 minutes. He had spent 30 years accumulating very little that mattered. The apartment would sort itself out. The furniture came with it anyway. He took his photographs off the wall and put them in the bag, and then stood in the empty bedroom for a long moment and felt the particular weight of a man who has just discovered that the only identity he ever had is gone. The 1987 Harley Softail waited in the parking lot. He had bought it with his own money in 1991 and maintained it with his own hands every year since. That was his. Nobody could take that. He rode east. No destination. No plan. Just the white line disappearing under the front wheel, and the engine speaking in the only language that still made sense to him. He avoided the usual spots. He did not stop at places where brothers or rivals might recognize him. The open road that had been his sanctuary for 30 years now felt different. It felt like exile. Each mile was another mile away from the only person he had ever known how to be. 3 weeks east. Tennessee appeared around him quietly, the way Tennessee does. Rolling hills going green and gold, small towns with 1 gas station and 1 church, and a diner that had been there, since 1962. He stayed in motels that charged by the week and ate at counters where the coffee came without being asked. His back ached from the road. He was 62 years old and the highway did not care. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when the engine started to talk back to him. The sound was low at first, a roughness beneath the usual rumble, something catching and not quite releasing on the uphill stretches. Wade pulled into a gas station outside a town called Hartwell and spent an hour with his hands inside the engine casing. The problem was deeper than his tools could reach. He needed a machine shop. He needed parts that were not available in any of the small towns he passed through. He limped the Harley west along Highway 70. The countryside opened up on either side of the road, farm fields that stretched toward distances that felt impossibly wide after years of California urban riding. The light came through the oak trees at a low angle. October light, the kind that makes everything look both beautiful and temporary. That was when he saw the farmhouse. It sat 200 yards off the main road, connected to it by a dirt driveway that had not seen regular traffic in years. Weeds had pushed through the gravel. The driveway itself had grass growing down the center stripe, a long green spine running up toward the house like something slowly reclaiming what it was owed. The house was white, or it had been white once. The paint came off the wooden siding in long, curling strips like bark from a tree that has given up growing. The front porch sagged on the left side, where a support beam had rotted through. Several shingles were missing from the roof, and the gaps showed dark against the October sky. The windows on the ground floor were intact, but filmed with years of dust. And in the front yard, despite everything, a single oak tree continued to grow. It was enormous, older than the house by decades, its branches spreading wide and still holding leaves that had turned the color of rust. It shaded the entire front of the house, as if it had appointed itself caretaker and intended to keep at it regardless of what happened to everything else. Wade looked at the house for a long time from the road. He thought about riding on. The engine made the decision for him. It coughed twice hard, then died completely as he turned into the driveway, and he rolled to a stop halfway up the weedy gravel lane and sat there in the sudden silence with the smell of oil on his hands and nowhere particular to be. He pushed the Harley the rest of the way up. The bike was heavy without its engine a live dead weight that pulled against him on the slight grade. By the time he reached the porch steps, he was sweating despite the cool air. He climbed the steps. They groaned under him. The screen door hung off one hinge and swung away when he touched it. He stood in front of the main door, open maybe 3 inches, and he hesitated the way a man hesitates before entering territory that is not his. Then he pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Dust and mildew, and beneath those a deeper smell. The smell of a place that has been sealed and abandoned, where the air itself has given up on moving. His eyes adjusted to the dimness slowly. The curtains had gone gray with age, and very little light came through them. The front room held furniture covered with white sheets. Chairs and a sofa stood under their covers like shapes waiting to be revealed. A braided rug covered most of the hardwood floor. Its colors faded to the point where it was hard to say what they had once been. A stone fireplace occupied most of one wall, and on the mantelpiece above it stood a row of framed photographs. Wade crossed to the fireplace and looked at them. A young couple on their wedding day. The woman wore a simple white dress and held a small bouquet of wildflowers. The man stood beside her in a suit that did not quite fit his shoulders, and he was grinning the way young men grin when they cannot quite believe their luck. On the back of the frame, in handwriting barely visible, someone had written Earl and Agnes, June 1958. June. More photographs. Children at various ages playing in what must have been this same yard. when the yard was mowed and the porch was level. A boy of maybe 10 holding up a fish. 2 children on a tire swing. The same couple, again older, standing in a garden behind the house. The garden was enormous and clearly tended with real devotion. Agnes wore a wide-brimmed hat against the sun. Earl had his arm around her and was looking not at the camera but at her. Wade stood in front of those photographs for a long time. He had no photographs like that. He had the ones in his duffel bag. The club photographs, the group shots outside bars on runs through states he had long since left behind. But he had no photographs of a woman holding wildflowers. He had no photographs of children on a tire swing in a yard. He had mowed himself. He moved through the rest of the house. The kitchen still had dishes in the sink. A coffee mug sat on the counter as if its owner had stepped outside for a moment and would be back shortly. A calendar hung on the wall beside the refrigerator. The calendar showed April 2012. Someone had circled the 15th and written dentist in careful print. And then, whoever it was had not torn off that page in the years that followed. April 2012 had simply become permanent. He found the property deed in a kitchen drawer folded inside an old phone directory for Wilson County. The deed showed the property belonging to Earl Hargrove, purchased 1971. Tax records showed payments current through 2011, then nothing. The property had been sitting in arrears for 4 years. And attached to the deed with a piece of tape dried and curled at the edges, a small note written in blue ink on a scrap of lined paper. For Cole, when you are ready to come home. Love, Grandpa Earl. Wade read it twice. He set it carefully on the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the backyard, where the remnants of an enormous garden were still visible beneath years of overgrowth. Fence posts stood at irregular intervals. A greenhouse frame caught the last of the afternoon light at the far end of the yard, though most of its glass panels were gone. He explored the upstairs. 3 bedrooms. The master bedroom felt deeply personal still, as if its occupants had only stepped out for an errand and left their things arranged exactly as they liked. A pair of reading glasses on the nightstand, books stacked beside them, a wooden jewelry box on the dresser with a small bird carved into the lid, a child's room at the end of the hall. Model airplanes hung from the ceiling on lengths of fishing line yellowed and still. A train set on a plywood table beneath the window, everything frozen. A museum of a childhood that had ended somewhere else. By the time Wade came back downstairs, the sun was low. He stood at the back door and looked out over the property in the fading light. 3 acres at least. The oak tree cast a long shadow across the front yard. The tool shed stood to the right of the house, its door closed. He went back to the bike and got his sleeping bag and camp stove and 2 cans from his saddlebag. He moved the sheet-covered sofa aside and laid his sleeping bag on the braided rug. He heated a can of beans on the camp stove and ate them in the near dark, sitting with his back against the cold stone fireplace and the family photographs watching him from the mantelpiece. He was 62 years old. He had been removed from the only family he had ever known. He was sleeping on the floor of a stranger's abandoned house with a broken motorcycle and $240 to his name. He looked at the photograph of Earl and Agnes in the garden. Agnes in her wide-brimmed hat. Earl looking at her instead of the camera. Wade ate his beans and did not sleep for a long time. Morning came with birds. He had not heard birds in years. Or rather, he had not heard them the way he heard them now. Through the silence of a house that had no traffic outside, and no neighbors close enough to matter. They were loud and various, and they began before full light. And by the time the sun came through the gray curtains, Wade was already standing at the back door with coffee he had made from the camp kit looking out at the overgrown yard. The garden was bigger than it had seemed from upstairs. Nearly half the property had been devoted to it, and even under 3 years of weeds and wild grass, the bones of it were still visible. Raised beds built from cedar planks gone gray and soft at the corners, but mostly intact. Stone pathways between them, the stone shifted by frost, but still there. The greenhouse frame caught the morning light. Someone had built all of this by hand over many years. Earl Hargrove had put real time and real love into this ground. Wade walked to the tool shed and opened it. The tools hung in orderly rows on pegboard, properly cleaned and oiled, before the shed was closed for what turned out to be the last time. Hammers of 3 different sizes, hand saws, a level, chisels, measuring tapes. A workbench ran along the back wall, scarred by decades of use, and beneath it drawers of fasteners sorted by type and size, with a precision that spoke of a man who valued order and had enough patience to maintain it. Wade picked up the largest hammer, a framing hammer, heavy and long-handled. The grip worn smooth by years of use, shaped by the pressure of hands that had swung it 10,000 times. He turned it over slowly in his own hands. He had not held a construction tool since his early 20s, before Oakland, before the Angels. He looked at the broken porch. He looked at the hammer. He spent that first day making a list. He walked every room and every exterior wall and wrote down what was wrong, and the list was long. The roof needed new shingles in at least 4 sections. 3 ground floor windows had cracked panes. The front porch had 2 boards that would not survive another winter. The gutters were packed solid with years of leaves. The plumbing was shut off at the main. The electrical service had been disconnected. He started with the porch, not because it was the most urgent problem, but because it was the first thing a person saw when they came up the driveway. He found lumber in the shed, old planks stored upright and reasonably dry. He pulled the 2 rotten boards and replaced them with pieces cut to fit, and he nailed them down with the framing hammer. And the sound of the hammer striking the nail head rang out across the empty yard and scattered the birds from the oak tree. It was the best sound he had heard in 3 weeks. He walked to town in the late afternoon. The main road was 2 miles east, and beyond it another 1.5 miles to the center of Millhaven, which was the name of the town. Though center was a generous word for 4 blocks of storefronts. A gas station, a diner, a church, and a general store with a hand-painted sign that read Callaway's. He was half a mile from town when an old pickup slowed beside him, and the driver, a man in his 60s with hands like cured leather, leaned out the window. The man asked if he was the one staying out at the Hargrove place. Wade said he was passing through, said his bike had broken down. The man nodded the way people nod when they know more than they are ready to say. Then he said Earl Hargrove was a good man. Said Earl had worked that land for 40 years. Said things went wrong after the boy died, and that after that Earl just did not have the heart for it anymore. Wade asked what boy. The man said the grandson. Said he died over in Afghanistan. Said after that Earl packed up and went to a care facility in Nashville and did not look back. The man offered Wade a ride and Wade declined. He needed the walk. He thought about the note on the deed the whole 2 miles into town. For Cole. When you are ready to come home. Cole had not come home. Cole had died in Afghanistan. The note had been written for a man who would never read it, to be left in a drawer, in a house that was slowly losing its battle with time. The general store had a bell over the door that rang when he pushed it open. The store was the kind that sells 100 different things and not quite enough of any of them. Hardware beside canned goods, beside motor oil, beside seed packets, a rack of local newspapers near the door. Behind the counter stood a woman of about 52, with gray threaded through dark hair. She wore pulled back practically. She had steady eyes and the kind of hands that told you she had worked hard for a long time. She looked at Wade the way people in small towns look at strangers, with a curiosity that was direct without being rude. She said her name was Ruth Calloway, said she owned the store, said she could order most things if she did not have them on the shelves. Wade said his name and said his motorcycle had broken down at the old Hargrove property and that he needed some food and some batteries. Ruth went quiet in a way that was not unfriendly. She said that poor house had been sitting empty for 3 years and that it was a shame. Said Earl Hargrove had been a fixture in this valley for as long as anyone could remember. Then she said something that stopped Wade mid-reach for a can on the shelf. She said Earl was still alive. Wade turned around slowly. Ruth told him what she knew, and what she knew was considerable. Earl Hargrove was 81 years old and living in a memory care facility outside Nashville. He had sold his truck and given his dog to a neighbor, and driven himself there one morning in March of 2012, after his grandson Bobby died in Kandahar. Earl had told her he could not stay in that house alone. Said every room had somebody in it who was no longer there. Wade paid for his supplies and walked back to the farmhouse in the near dark, with groceries in a paper bag and the weight of other people's grief sitting somewhere in his chest, in a place he could not quite name. He was back at the house before full dark. He ate at the kitchen counter and looked at the calendar on the wall. April 2012. The dentist appointment circled in pen. Earl had left in the middle of that same month. He had not torn the page before he went. Wade reached up carefully and took the calendar off its nail. He folded it once and set it on the counter beside the note from the deed. In the morning, he started on the gutters. The days settled into a rhythm that surprised him with how complete it felt. He woke before light made coffee stood at the back door, watching the sun rise over the Tennessee hills. Then he worked, methodical and unhurried, moving through the list item by item, taking each problem in the order the house needed it addressed. The roof work took most of a week. He found asphalt shingles in the shed left from a project Earl had started but not finished, and he carried them up the ladder in sections and worked across the damaged areas with the deliberate pace of a man who had nothing else to do and no reason to hurry. The physical work was something he had not expected to need. His body responded to it in ways the road had never provided. His back ached differently. The honest ache of used muscles rather than the grinding ache of long hours on a motorcycle seat. He slept deeply. He did not dream about Oakland. Ruth came by on the 3rd day. She pulled her truck to the end of the driveway and called up to him on the roof and asked if he needed anything from the store. He said he needed roofing nails and a tube of sealant. She brought them and stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee from his camp kit and tell him more about the Hargrove family. Not because he had asked, but because she understood that the house deserved to be understood by whoever was working on it. She told him about Agnes's garden, how it produced enough vegetables to supply half the families in the valley through summer, and how Agnes had given most of it away freely. She told him Earl had built most of the furniture inside the house with his own hands. She told him the greenhouse had been Earl's gift to Agnes on their 40th anniversary, built on a Saturday in May, while Agnes was at her sister's house completed and planted with seedlings before she came home. Wade listened and did not say much. He was good at listening. The angels had valued that in him, the ability to sit in a room and hear things without needing to fill every silence with himself. On the evening of his 6th day, He was replacing a cracked board on the porch steps when he noticed he was being watched. A boy stood at the end of the driveway, 16 years old, maybe thin in the way teenagers are before they grow into themselves. Dark hair that needed cutting. Jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up despite the cool air. He stood with his bicycle beside him, and he watched Wade work with the careful attention of someone who was trying to decide something. Wade kept working. He drove 3 nails without looking up. Then he set the hammer down and looked at the boy. He said one word. Evening. The boy startled slightly. Then he walked his bicycle a few steps closer. He said he had heard someone was fixing up the place. Then he said his name. Cole Hargrove. Wade was still for a moment. He thought of the note on the deed. He thought of what Ruth had told him and what the farmer in the truck had said. He thought about the man who had gone to Afghanistan and not come home. He said he thought Cole Hargrove was gone. The boy looked at him evenly and said, "That was my dad." Wade set his hammer on the porch railing. He looked at Cole the way you look at something that changes the shape of what you thought you understood. Bobby Hargrove Jr. had been Cole's father. Earl's grandson, not his son. The note in the drawer had been written for Bobby, who had gone to Kandahar and not returned. This boy was Bobby's son. The generation after the generation that had not come home. He was 16 years old, and he had the same stubborn jaw as the young man in the wedding photograph on the mantelpiece, the young Earl Hargrove, grinning at his luck in 1958. Wade asked Cole if he was hungry. Cole said he had eaten. Then he said, "Can I watch?" He watched for 2 hours that first evening, sitting on the porch railing while Wade finished the steps. He did not talk much. He asked a few technical questions about why Wade was using galvanized nails rather than standard ones, and Wade explained about rust and moisture, and why you always plan for what the wood would face 10 years from now, not just today. Cole came back the next afternoon, and the day after that. Within a week, he was no longer watching. He was working alongside Wade, learning to measure twice and cut once, learning how to read the grain of old wood to predict where it would split, learning the patience required to set a nail flush without dimpling the surrounding surface. He had good hands, patient and deliberate, the kind you could not teach, only discover. They did not talk about Earl. They did not talk about Bobby. They worked, and the work said what needed saying without requiring words. November came in with cold mornings and light that went low and gold by mid-afternoon. The house was changing. The porch was solid underfoot now. The roof shed rain the way a roof should. The gutters ran clear. Inside, the kitchen floor had stopped moving when you walked across it, because Wade had replaced the 3 buckled boards. Cole brought 2 things one afternoon. He brought a covered dish his mother had sent, a chicken casserole in a baking pan with foil over the top. And he brought a question. He asked Wade if he was going to stay. Wade looked at the question from the inside out for a moment. He said he did not know. He said the bike still needed parts, and the house still needed work. He said he was not in any particular hurry. Cole nodded. He took the foil off the casserole and found 2 plates in the kitchen cabinet and set them on the table without being asked. They ate in the kitchen with the calendar still on its nail on the wall. April 2012. Permanent and unchanging, and outside the window, the yard went dark as the last of the October light dropped behind the western hills. It was Cole who found the newspaper. They were working on the master bedroom on a gray November afternoon, packing up the personal items Earl had left behind into the cardboard boxes Ruth had sent over from the store. Wade had handled each thing with deliberate care. as if each object was evidence of something important which he had come to believe it was. The reading glasses, the Bible with Agnes's name inside the front cover, the stopped watch. Cole opened the bottom nightstand drawer. He went very still. Wade looked up from the box he was packing. Cole was holding a newspaper, not a recent one. The paper had gone yellow at the edges and dry enough to crinkle when held. The Nashville Banner, July 2009. He was reading the front page and the color had drained from his face, in the way color drains when a person encounters something they half knew was there, but was not prepared to find. Wade crossed the room. The headline read, "3 killed in I-40. Crash-drunk driver charged." Below it, a photograph of a wreck on an interstate at night. Emergency lights reflected in rain-slicked asphalt. And beside the headline photograph, a smaller family portrait. A man in his early 30s, a woman about the same age, a small girl of maybe 6 with her hair in 2 careful braids. The caption, Garrett Hargrove, 32. Jennifer Hargrove, 31. Lily Hargrove, 6. Cole sat down on the edge of the bed. He sat the way a person sits when their legs have decided to stop cooperating with the rest of them. Wade sat beside him. Cole began talking in a voice that was very quiet and very flat. The voice of someone reporting facts that have been stored somewhere internal for so long they have calcified into something close to ordinary information. He said Garrett was his father's older brother. He said the accident happened on a Sunday night in July 2009, when Garrett and Jennifer were driving back to Nashville after dinner at Earl and Agnes's house. A drunk driver going the wrong way on the interstate. All 3 of them were gone before the ambulance arrived. Lily was 6 years old. He said Earl never forgave himself for inviting them to dinner that night. He said his father, Bobby, had not been there that Sunday. Bobby had been working a construction job in Clarksville. He had come for the funerals and had stayed for 6 months. And then in January 2010, he had walked into a recruitment office and enlisted. When people asked him why, he said it was because he wanted to serve his country. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He told me the same thing. I was old enough to understand what he was not saying." Bobby Hargrove had joined the Army because he did not know how to stay in a place that had become entirely grief. Because every time he drove past the farm, he thought about Garrett and Jennifer and little Lily in her braids. Because the Army offered him a version of himself that was not defined by loss. Bobby had died in Kandahar in April 2012. Cole had been 13 years old. 3 layers of the same family destroyed in less than 3 years. Garrett and Jennifer and Lily in one night in July. Bobby in a morning in April. An Earl who was still alive in a way, but had left this house and everything in it, including the calendar on the wall and the note in the drawer. Because staying had become impossible. Wade sat next to Cole on the edge of the bed and did not say anything for a long time. There was nothing to say that would make any of it smaller or more manageable. He thought about his own 30 years, the running, the belonging to a brotherhood that asked you to be hard and stay moving and never sit long enough in any one place for the silence to find you. The way a man can spend decades filling his life with noise so that certain questions never get quiet enough to be heard. He looked at this 16-year-old boy sitting in his great-grandfather's house with a 6-year-old newspaper in his hands, understanding for perhaps the first time that the men in this family had a habit of leaving when things became unbearable. Earl had left. Bobby had left in his own way. And Cole was 16 and visiting a farmhouse that legally belonged to no one because the person it had been left for was buried in a country his son had never been able to name. without his voice changing. Wade put one hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment. Then he took it away. He said, "Your great-grandfather built this place with his hands. All of it. He built it to last." Cole looked at the newspaper. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on the nightstand beside the Bible and the stopped watch. He said, "I know." The cold settled in through November. Wade wired a battery lamp to the front porch, and the small yellow light burned in the Tennessee evenings when he and Cole came back from working in the house. The roof held through the first two storms. He stood in the upstairs hallway during the second one, listening to the rain on the shingles overhead, and no water came through. He found this satisfying in a way that surprised him with its depth. He had done a thing, and the thing was holding. It was a small kind of order set against a large kind of disorder, and it was entirely his. It was in the third week of November that Ruth came by with a different kind of news. She pulled her truck in and sat in the cab for a moment before getting out, which was not like her. She came to the porch with a folded sheet of paper and handed it to Wade without saying anything first. It was a notice of condemnation hearing from the Wilson County Commission. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of December. The property had been flagged under the county blight ordinance due to tax arrears and prior safety violations. At the bottom of the notice, above the official seal of Wilson County, a signature. Commissioner Gerald Voss. Wade read it twice. Then he looked at Ruth. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Gerald Voss was the most respected man in Wilson County. Coached Little League for 15 years. Donated to every church in the valley. Won the county commission seat 3 terms running without meaningful opposition. She said this the way you describe someone's publicly visible dimensions when you are not yet ready to speak about the dimensions they keep hidden. Wade looked at the notice again. Then he looked at the farmhouse behind him, which currently had a solid roof and a cleared set of gutters and a porch you could walk across without worrying about your foot going through it. The safety violations cited in the notice had been remediated. He could prove that. Whether proof would matter in that room was a different question. He said he would be at the hearing. Cole was there the next afternoon, and Wade told him. Cole read the notice standing at the kitchen counter, and his jaw tightened in the way Wade had come to recognize as the boy's version of fury controlled and going inward rather than outward. Cole said this was his family's land. 4 generations of Hargroves had worked this soil. He was not going to be the one who let it disappear. Wade looked at the boy and heard something underneath the anger. The determination of a person who has lost enough and has decided somewhere below conscious thought that they are not going to lose this too. He said, "Then we fight for it." The county commission meeting was held in a room above the courthouse that smelled of old coffee and institutional carpet and the stale air of rooms where decisions are made by people accustomed to making them without significant resistance. Metal folding chairs arranged in rows. 5 commissioners at a long table. Commissioner Gerald Voss in the center chair. He was 58 years old and looked younger. He had the kind of face that photographs well open and symmetrical, with a smile that arrived reliably and departed slowly. He wore a jacket and tie the way men wear them when they want you to think the clothes are an afterthought. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings. His name appeared in the church bulletin most Sundays under community giving. The room was more full than Wade had expected. Ruth was there. Pastor Raymond Ellis was there, a quiet man in his mid-50s who had spent the previous 10 days helping Wade research the county's historical preservation statutes. Loretta Hayes was there, a woman in her early 70s who had lived in Wilson County since birth and who carried herself with the authority of someone who has outlived everyone who ever underestimated her. A dozen other faces Wade recognized from the general store or from passing on the road. He had not asked any of them to come. Wade stood when his name was called. He had worn his cleanest jeans and the buttoned shirt Cole had helped him choose. He had left his leather vest at the farmhouse. He was 62 years old and had not spoken before a public body since a courtroom in 1998 that he preferred not to think about. He said the property was in significantly better condition than it had been in September. The roof was repaired. The plumbing was restored. The safety violations in the notice had been remediated, and he could provide documented evidence. The heir to the property was a minor who intended to retain it, and the back taxes could be addressed given a reasonable extension. Voss interrupted. He did it smoothly, the way a man does who has interrupted many proceedings, and learned to make it appear like clarification. He said the commission dealt in documented facts. He said the property remained in arrears. He said certain information had come to the commission's attention regarding Mr. Briggs, and that the commission had an obligation to the community it served. He said Wade Briggs had spent 30 years as an enforcer for the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. He let that sit. He watched the room do what rooms do when they hear something like that. He watched the faces. And then Loretta Hayes stood up. She was not tall and she was not young, and she had to brace herself slightly on the chair back in front of her. But when she spoke, the room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when someone says something that lands with the weight of absolute conviction. She said she was 72 years old. She had lived in Wilson County her entire life. She said she knew how to read a person, not from documents, not from records. She said she had watched Wade Briggs work on the Hargrove property for 2 months, and that he had worked without pay, without recognition, and without anyone asking him to. She said she had watched him teach Earl Hargrove's great-grandson how to use a level, and how to measure a door frame, and how to treat old wood with the respect it had earned. She said she did not need a man's history to know what kind of man he was. She needed to watch him when nobody was looking, and she had. Then Ruth stood, then Pastor Ellis, then a farmer named Henderson whose land adjoined the Hargrove property, who said simply that Earl Hargrove would have wanted someone to care for that place, and that from everything he had seen, someone was doing exactly that. Voss tried to maintain the procedural momentum of the hearing. He gavelled twice. He said the commission needed to return to the documented record, but the room had found its voice. The hearing ended without a resolution tabled to the following month. No decision, no victory, but not defeat either. Wade walked out of the courthouse into the cold November air. Cole was waiting on the steps. The boy looked at him for a moment, taking in whatever he could read in Wade's face. Then Cole said, "That was your whole past right there in that room, and they still stood up for you." Wade looked out across the parking lot toward the street. He said, "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The cold air came off the hills to the west and moved through the oaks along the street. He said, "Come on. There is still work to do on the bathroom floor." They drove back to the farmhouse in the early dark, the hills going black against a sky still faintly lit at the horizon. And the house was there when they arrived, solid and rectangular against the darkness, the battery lamp burning on the porch. That small yellow light steady in the Tennessee evening. Wade looked at it for a moment before getting out of the truck. 30 years. He had given 30 years to a brotherhood that had handed him a 2-paragraph letter and asked for his colors back. He had ridden east with nothing and had stopped in this driveway because his engine gave out. And in 2 months of work, he had not been asked to do in a house that did not belong to him, in a town where nobody owed him anything. He had become something he did not entirely have a word for yet. He got out of the truck. Cole was already heading for the front door. The porch boards did not groan when they crossed them. Wade had replaced them. They held. December came in hard. The first week brought 3 days of rain that turned the driveway to soft clay and made the work inside more pressing than the work outside. Wade spent those wet days on the bathroom floor replacing the subfloor that had gone soft from a slow leak under the toilet. A problem that had likely been growing for years before whoever last lived here noticed it or decided it was someone else's concern. The work was close and uncomfortable, flat on his back in a narrow space with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. But he was methodical about it, the way he had learned to be methodical about everything in the past 2 months. Patient with each step, because the step after it depended on the one before being right. Cole came on the weekends. On school days, he sometimes appeared at the end of the driveway in the late afternoon, not always coming up to the house. Sometimes just standing there looking at the place for a few minutes before getting back on his bicycle and riding into town. Wade noticed this and said nothing about it. He understood the need to check that a thing was still there. The second week of December brought the cold down from the north in a way that made the first weeks of November feel like a dress rehearsal. Wade found 2 electric space heaters in the basement, old but functional, and he ran them in the rooms he used. The rest of the house was cold, in the way old houses are cold. A deep settled cold that had been accumulating since the heat was last turned on in 2012. He thought about Earl Hargrove sitting in that care facility in Nashville in whatever room they had given him, looking at whatever view there was from that window. The man had built this house's furniture with his own hands. He had built Agnes her greenhouse on a Saturday in May. He had farmed this ground for 40 years and raised his family in these rooms and tended this valley with a devotion that was visible in every fence post and garden bed and carefully stored tool. And then one morning in April 2012, he had driven himself to Nashville and not come back. Wade understood the impulse. He understood it with a specificity that was not entirely comfortable. He had spent 30 years in motion, because motion kept him from having to be in any one place long enough for it to ask anything of him. The difference between him and Earl was that Earl had built something worth leaving. Wade had left nothing behind in Oakland except a duffel bag's worth of photographs and a landlord who would be irritated about the rent. He drove roofing nails in the cold and thought about the distinction. The letter arrived on a Friday. It was not official correspondence this time. It came in a plain envelope hand-delivered left in the mailbox at the end of the driveway. Inside a single typed page. No signature. The page detailed certain considerations the writer felt Wade should be aware of. It noted that 2 local contractors had recently been advised that taking further jobs associated with the Hargrove property would create complications with county permitting processes for their own businesses. It noted that the hardware supplier in Hartwell had received a similar communication. It noted that these were simply the kinds of things that happened in small counties when the commission had concerns about a property. Wade read the page standing at the mailbox in the cold. He read it again. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He had not needed the contractors. He had not needed the hardware supplier in Hartwell, or not often. Ruth stocked most of what he needed at Callaway's, and when she did not, she ordered it without comment. The letter was intended to feel like encirclement, like the closing of options. What it actually told him was that Gerald Voss was watching this property more closely than a routine condemnation proceeding required, and that he was willing to make unofficial phone calls to achieve outcomes that the formal process might not guarantee. A man who made unofficial phone calls to small contractors and hardware suppliers was a man who had done this kind of thing before. A man who had done it before was a man who was accustomed to it working. Wade went back to the house and spent the afternoon replacing the cracked pane in the kitchen window. He worked slowly and carefully, the old glass coming out in pieces he wrapped in newspaper, before disposing the new pane going in with glazing compound, applied smoothly around all four edges. When it was done, the window was whole and weather-tight. He thought about Voss the whole time. He thought about the architecture of a man like that. The visible surface, the Little League, and the church giving, and the 3 consecutive terms on the county commission. The warmth of the smile and the reliability of the handshake. And underneath that surface, something practical and self-interested and willing to make phone calls. Wade had known men like that his entire adult life. He had known them in the club and outside it. He was not afraid of them. But he recognized them, and recognizing one meant understanding that the formal process of the commission hearing was not the actual process. The actual process was whatever Gerald Voss wanted it to be, and the formal hearing was the shape that want was dressed in. Ruth called the farmhouse landline on a Thursday evening in the second week of December. She said she needed to come by the following morning. She said she had something for him. She arrived early before full light with a box in the bed of her truck. It was a cardboard file box, the standard kind with a lid pressed down over contents that made it slightly too full to close cleanly. She carried it to the kitchen table and set it down and looked at it for a moment before saying anything the way a person looks at something they have been asked to hold and are now ready to release. She said Earl had given it to her in March of 2012, the morning he left for Nashville. She said he had come into the store before it opened, which meant he had been waiting for her when she arrived, and that he had set this box on the counter and told her to hold it until the right person came. She said she had asked him what that meant. Earl had told her she would know. He said the right person would show up and stay when everyone else would have left. He said she would not have to wonder. She had held the box for 3.5 years. Wade stood across the kitchen table from her and looked at the box. He said, "What is in it?" Ruth said she knew some of what was in it. She said Earl had told her it was documentation. She said he had called it insurance and that he had said he did not entirely trust what he knew to the kind of people who were supposed to do something about it, because some of those people were part of what he knew. Wade opened the box. The contents were organized with the same careful order that characterized everything Earl Hargrove had left behind. File folders labeled in Earl's precise handwriting dates spanning from 2009 to 2011. Inside the folders, documents, county commission minutes, budget line items from the Wilson County Infrastructure Fund, invoices from a company called Voss Land Survey and Assessment, incorporated in Franklin, Tennessee, correspondence between the county engineer's office and that same company, permit applications filed with the Tennessee Department of Transportation, a map hand-drawn but carefully accurate with the Hargrove property marked at its center, and a development footprint sketched in pencil around it, labeled in handwriting that was not Earl's. Wade went through it slowly, folder by folder, setting each document on the kitchen table, with the attention of a man reading something in a foreign language he has been told he needs to understand. It took him an hour and a half. Ruth sat across from him with her coffee and did not interrupt. When he reached the bottom of the box, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Voss Land Survey and Assessment was owned by Dale Voss, Gerald Voss's younger brother. Over the course of 2010 and 2011, Wilson County had paid that company from the Infrastructure Improvement Fund for geological surveys and site assessments. The surveys were supposedly for a road improvement project on the eastern edge of the county. The actual surveys, as documented in a set of copies Earl had obtained from the county recorder's office, covered a different area entirely. They covered the land along Highway 70 west of Mill Haven, including the Hargrove property and the 3 adjacent parcels. Earl had obtained those records in late 2011. He had then made phone calls to the county assessor's office, to the county attorney, and to the regional office of the Tennessee comptroller. The notes in his own handwriting recorded what each of those offices had told him. The word "nothing" appeared in those notes often. The word "sorry" appeared twice. Then in July of 2009, Dale Voss's company had filed a preliminary development application with the county for a commercial truck stop and fuel facility on a parcel that in the application was listed as under contract for acquisition. The parcel was the Hargrove property. The application predated Earl's awareness of it by over a year. It predated the official condemnation proceedings by more than 4 years. Garrett Hargrove and his wife and daughter had died in July of 2009. The timeline sat in front of Wade on the kitchen table, and he read it the way you read a thing when you are trying to make sure you are reading it correctly. Garrett's death in July 2009 had not caused the plan, but it had provided an opportunity. A family already in grief, already destabilized, already losing the generational continuity that kept land like this inside the family it had always belonged to. Earl had spent 2010 watching it happen and understanding what he was watching and making phone calls that led nowhere. Then Bobby had gone to Afghanistan. Then Bobby had not come home. And Earl, who was old and tired and had lost more than a man his age should be asked to lose, had driven himself to Nashville and left a box in the general store for whoever would eventually come. Wade looked at Ruth. He said Earl knew nobody in this county was gonna help him. Ruth said he knew it was above the county. Wade said, and he was right. He spent the next 3 days with the box at the kitchen table, organizing the documents into a sequence that told a coherent story. He had no legal training, but he had 30 years of experience in organizations that operated outside official structures, which had taught him something about how power worked and where its weak points were, and more specifically about the difference between what a thing was and what it appeared to be. What this appeared to be was a routine infrastructure development proposal, advancing through normal channels. What it was documented across 47 pages in a cardboard box was a county official using public funds to subsidize his brother's business, while steering a condemnation process to force a family off their land at below market value. He called Pastor Ellis on the landline. Ellis came the next morning and sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours going through the documents, with the systematic attention of a man who had spent decades in institutional structures and understood how to read the evidence of their misuse. He said nothing for most of those 2 hours. When he finished, he folded his hands and said he knew an attorney in Nashville who handled public corruption cases and who owed him a conversation. Wade said he did not want to move too fast. He said he needed to understand the hearing timeline and what leverage this documentation represented before anything was filed officially. He said once something was formally submitted, it would be visible to Voss, and he wanted the visibility to happen at the right moment. Ellis looked at him across the table. He said, "You have done this kind of thing before." Wade said, "Not the legal part." Ellis understood that. He said he would make the call to Nashville and report back. He said the documents would need to be copied and the originals secured somewhere outside the property. Wade said Ruth's store had a safe in the back office. Ellis said that would work. The days between Christmas and New Year came and went quietly. Cole was home from school on break and spent more time at the farmhouse than usual. working alongside Wade on the interior walls of the living room, repairing the plaster in the places where moisture had crept in over the years and left long cracks from ceiling to baseboard. The work was tedious in the way finished work is tedious, requiring patience and a tolerance for imperfection that could only be corrected by repeated thin coats and long drying times. They listened to the radio while they worked, a country station out of Nashville that played old songs, mostly Haggard and Jones and Christopherson music that was about things like roads and loss and the loneliness of being somewhere other than where you were supposed to be. Cole did not seem to know the songs, but he listened without complaint. And after a while, he began to hum along with the melodies even when he did not know the words. On New Year's Eve, Ruth brought a bottle of bourbon and 3 glasses to the farmhouse, and she and Wade and Cole sat on the porch under the cold stars and did not talk much. The valley below them was dark and still. Somewhere to the south, a neighbor had fireworks, and they watched them rise and fall, the colors small at that distance, but still visible, still worth watching. At midnight, Cole raised his glass and said simply, "One more year." Wade raised his. One more year. January arrived, and with it the notice of the rescheduled commission hearing. Second week of February. Commissioner Voss was listed as presiding. Wade read the notice and put it on the refrigerator with the same piece of tape that had held the April 2012 calendar page. He was standing at the kitchen counter 3 days into January, early morning coffee in hand, looking out the window at the frost on the yard, when he heard the sound. It came from the direction of the driveway. A motorcycle engine running rough, the irregular misfire of a machine being asked to do more than it currently could. The sound cut out entirely about halfway up the driveway and was replaced by silence, and then by the sound of boots on gravel. Wade set down his coffee. He went to the front door and opened it. A man was pushing a motorcycle up the driveway in the January cold. He was approximately 40 years old, lean in the way that is less about fitness than about not having excess of anything, with the careful posture of a person who has been trained to hold themselves in a way that does not give information away unnecessarily. He wore a jacket that was not warm enough for January in Tennessee, and he was pushing a Harley Iron 883, with the focus of a man who has already spent more time pushing it than he intended. He stopped when he saw Wade on the porch. He looked at the house, and then at Wade, and then at the driveway behind him, as if calculating whether going back down was a viable option. Wade said, "Engine trouble." The man said, "Heard a noise about 15 miles back. Ran for another 5 and then quit completely." Wade stepped off the porch and walked down to where the man was standing with his motorcycle. He looked at the engine without touching it. He could hear the problem from how the last few miles had sounded, a compression issue in the front cylinder. Probably a valve, something that would not be fixed with roadside tools. He said, "That bike is not going anywhere today." The man said, "I figured." Wade said, "What is your name?" The man said, "Seth." Seth Pruitt. He was 40 years old. He stood in the Hargrove driveway in January cold with a broken motorcycle and the stillness of a man who has learned to wait without giving anything away. And Wade recognized that stillness because he had worn it himself for 30 years. And underneath it, he recognized something else. The exhaustion of a person who has been carrying something for too long and has started to not remember what it felt like before. Wade told him to bring the bike up to the barn. They pushed it together up the last of the driveway and into the barn, which was heated marginally by the proximity of the attached shed and the insulation Wade had added to 2 of its walls in November. Seth looked around the barn, the way you look around a place when you are trying to understand what kind of person inhabits it. He noticed the organization, the tools in their places. The old Harley Softail against the far wall, polished and maintained, covered with a cloth against the dust. Seth said, "Nice bike." Wade said, "1987. I keep it for its own sake at this point." Seth looked at the barn for another moment. Then he said he had been riding since September. He did not explain from where or toward what. Wade said, "You hungry?" Seth said he had not eaten since the day before. Wade said he would make something. He said Seth could sleep in the back bedroom that night if he needed to, that there was a bed, and the heat worked and no one was using it. He said it was January in Tennessee, and there was no reason to be stupid about it. Seth looked at him. He said, "Why?" Wade said, "Same reason you stopped in the driveway instead of pushing that bike to the next town." Sometimes things stop where they stop for a reason. This was not something Wade had said aloud before. He was not sure where it had come from. But it was true in the way that things are true when you have been living with them long enough to recognize them. They ate at the kitchen table scrambled eggs and toast and black coffee. Seth ate with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to not being sure when the next meal would be. Gradually and in pieces over the course of that first day and the days that followed, Seth Pruitt's story came out. He was from outside Nashville originally, had joined the Marine Corps at 22. 2 tours in Afghanistan combat engineer, the kind of work that required you to go first into places that were most likely to kill you, and to do it calmly, because calmness was the only thing that kept you functional. He had been good at it. He said this without pride, the way you describe a professional capacity you no longer use. He had come back from his second tour to a marriage that had done its best and used up its best in the process. His wife Nora had tried in ways he could see clearly now, but had not been able to respond to then. She had needed him to be present, and he had not known how to be present in the way she needed the ordinary intimate present of evenings at home and weekends without a plan. He had been trained to operate in threat environments, and the absence of a threat environment had been its own kind of disorienting. They had divorced 3 years after his discharge. There were 2 daughters. Emma was 10, and Katie was 9. Wade listened without commenting. Cole was in school during the days Seth told him these things, and the work of the barn gave their conversations a backdrop that made them easier than conversations conducted face to face, sitting still. Seth worked without being asked. He was looking at a loose post in the barn's east wall on his second morning, and had a replacement post fitted and set before noon. His hands knew tools with the intimacy of a man who had spent years in field conditions where the ability to fix things quickly was not a preference, but a survival requirement. On the 3rd day, working side by side on the barn roof, Seth said he had not told Wade the most important part of why he was in Wilson County. Wade kept working. Seth said he had been in the same unit as a man named Bobby Hargrove in Kandahar, 2012. 3rd tour for Seth first, and only for Bobby. Wade set down his hammer. Seth said Bobby had been a good soldier. Said he had been the kind of man who made the unit around him steadier by virtue of being steady himself. Said Bobby had talked about his family sometimes, about his grandfather's farm in Tennessee, about a boy named Cole he was going to come home to. Seth said Bobby had died in April 2012. He said it was quick, that the clinical meaning of quick in that context was all you could offer, and that he had offered it to himself many times in the years since. He said he had been the one to recover Bobby's effects. He paused. He said Bobby had a letter on him, sealed, addressed in his own handwriting. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. It was worn at the corners, and the fold lines were soft from handling the way paper gets when it has been taken out and considered and put back many times over years. The envelope was cream-colored, and the ink had faded slightly, but was still legible. The address read, "For my son, Cole. To be read when he is ready." Seth held it in both hands for a moment. Then he set it on the roof between them. He said Bobby asked me directly, before that last mission. He handed me this, and he said if he did not come back, I should see that his son got it. He did not say how old Cole would need to be. He just said when he is ready. Seth had gone to the Hargrove farm in October 2012. The house was already empty. A neighbor had told him Earl had gone to a care facility in Nashville. Seth had driven to Nashville and found the facility and asked to see Earl Hargrove. The staff had been kind. They had told him Earl was having a very difficult time with memory and recognition. He had sat across from the old man for an hour, and the old man had not known who he was. Seth had carried the letter for 3 years. He said he had heard about the Hargrove property through the VFW post in Nashville. Someone had mentioned the old farm in Wilson County, and the man who was working on it, and the boy who came to help on weekends. He said he had gotten in his truck and driven down, and then when he was close enough to reconsider, he had gotten back on his motorcycle instead, and now the motorcycle had broken down in the driveway. He said, "I do not know if I am doing the right thing by being here." Wade looked at the envelope on the roof between them. He thought about Earl sitting in that care facility not knowing who had come to sit across from him. He thought about Bobby writing a letter before a mission and pressing it into the hands of the man he trusted most to see it delivered. He thought about Seth Pruitt carrying that envelope from 2012 to January 2015, 3 years and some number of miles and an uncounted number of times taking it out and looking at the handwriting and not knowing what to do with it. He said, "You are doing the right thing. You are 3 years late, and you are doing the right thing." Seth looked at the Tennessee hills for a long moment. He said, "Does the boy know I am here?" Wade said, "Not yet." He said, "I will talk to him first." Cole came on the Saturday after Seth's arrival. He came up the driveway on his bicycle as he always did, and Wade met him at the porch and told him there was someone in the barn he should meet. He told Cole only the facts, not what they meant or what Seth was carrying. Cole walked to the barn with the careful expression of someone who is bracing themselves by instinct for something they have not yet been told to brace for. Seth was at the workbench when they came in. He stood when he saw Cole, and he looked at the boy in the attentive way a person looks when they are trying to see someone they have only heard described. Cole looked back at him. Wade introduced them simply. He said Seth had served with his father in Afghanistan. The barn was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and moved through the oak tree at the front of the house, with a sound like something breathing. Cole said, "You knew my dad." Seth said I did. He was a good man. He talked about you often. Cole stood very still. Seth said, "He asked me to give you something. He said to wait until you were ready. He said you would know when." He held out the envelope. Cole looked at it. He looked at his father's handwriting on the cream-colored envelope, the words addressing him, the pen pressure visible in the slightly raised ridges of the ink. He looked at it the way you look at something you have wanted and feared simultaneously. He took the envelope with both hands. He held it for a long time. He turned it over once and then back. He pressed his thumb against the seal which Bobby had fastened shut, and which had held shut for 3 years through everything Seth had carried it through. He did not open it. He folded it gently and put it in the pocket of his flannel shirt close to his chest. He looked at Seth and said, "Thank you." Then he went to the workbench and picked up a piece of sandpaper and began working on a board he had been finishing the week before. His hands were steady. His back was to both of them. Wade looked at Seth. Seth looked at Wade. Then Seth turned back to his own work, and the barn was filled again with the sounds of the work, the rasp of the sandpaper, the sound the Tennessee wind made through the old timber of the rafters. Outside, the January cold pressed against the walls, and the oak tree moved, and the house stood where it had stood since Earl Hargrove built it, holding against weather and time, and everything else with the patient solidity of a thing constructed to last. The days between Seth's arrival and the February hearing took on a quality that Wade recognized as the quality of a period just before something large happens. The work continued, but it was background now, the thing that kept hands busy while minds ran ahead. Pastor Ellis came twice with the attorney from Nashville, a quiet woman named Abigail Stern, who was about 45 years old, and who read the documents in Earl's box with the focused economy of someone who had read documents like this before and knew exactly what she was looking at. She asked precise questions and wrote precise notes, and at the end of her second visit, she told Wade that what he had was real and substantive and that it would need to be handled carefully to be effective. She used the word timing with a specific emphasis. She said the moment of introduction mattered as much as the content. Wade understood timing. He had spent 30 years in an organization where the introduction of information at the wrong moment could have consequences that could not be corrected. He had learned patience in contexts that did not reward impatience. He waited. Seth stayed. He did not discuss staying. He simply continued to be present, working each day on whatever needed working, on eating at the kitchen table, sleeping in the back bedroom. He called Emma and Katie on Wednesday evenings from the landline, and Wade stayed out of the kitchen during those calls. Not because Seth asked him to, but because privacy was a thing Wade understood the value of. Cole opened the letter on a Sunday in late January. He did not announce that he was going to do it. Wade came in from the barn to find Cole sitting at the kitchen table in the gray afternoon light, with the envelope open in front of him and the pages in his hands. Wade stopped at the kitchen door. Cole looked up at him. He said, "You can come in." Wade came in and sat across the table. He did not ask to read it. He waited. Cole said his father had written 3 pages. He said the handwriting was very careful. The kind of careful a person is when they know they have one chance to say something correctly. He said his father had written about Earl. He said Bobby had written that he knew what the grief of the last years had done to the family, what the loss of Garrett and Jennifer and little Lily had cost each one of them. He wrote that he understood Earl's guilt, and that it was the kind of guilt a good man could not put down, and that he had gone into the army not to escape that guilt, but because he had needed to become someone whose actions matched the size of the love he felt, because love without action had felt inadequate to everything they had lost. Cole paused. He looked at the pages in his hands. He said the last part of the letter was about him. His voice did not change. It stayed level and careful, the same controlled flatness Wade had heard the day Cole found the newspaper. The voice of a young man who has learned to say hard things by making his voice go very quiet. Bobby had written, "Someday a man will find his way to our door. He will not look the way you expect a good man to look. He will have a past that does not recommend him. But you will know him by this: he will stay when staying is the harder choice. He will fix things not because anyone asked him to, but because he cannot stand to see them broken. That is what an Earl Hargrove man does. And if you find that man Cole, you hold on to him. Because that is what family is, not blood alone. What we choose when we could choose otherwise. The kitchen was quiet. The space heater ticked in the corner. Outside, the wind moved through the oak tree, and the January light was going gray toward evening. Wade looked at his hands on the table. His hands which had done things he would not detail to this boy, or to anyone, which had carried the record of a life he was not proud of, in the way your hands carry things. He looked at them on the kitchen table in Earl Hargrove's house, and he could not speak for a moment. Cole folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. He set the envelope on the table between them. He said, "He wrote that a year before he died. He did not know you existed." Wade said nothing. Cole said, "But he described you exactly." The February hearing date arrived on a Thursday morning, cold and clear. The kind of Tennessee winter morning where the sky is a hard, bright blue, and the ground is iron hard underfoot, and your breath comes out white and visible in the air. Wade drove to the courthouse with Ruth beside him and Cole in the back seat. Seth stayed at the farmhouse. This was not his fight in the way that mattered today, though. What he had brought to it was irreplaceable. The room above the courthouse was full, fuller than November. Word had moved through the valley in the weeks since the first hearing word about what Wade had found in Earl's box and what Abigail Stern had confirmed it meant. And people had come. Gerald Voss sat at the center of the commissioner's table in his jacket and tie and smiled at the room with the practiced warmth of a man who has been smiling at rooms for 20 years and has never once had the room smile back in a way that cost him anything. Pastor Ellis stood when the public comment period opened. He spoke quietly and precisely for 7 minutes. He summarized what the documents showed. He named the company. He named the relationship between Dale Voss and the commissioner. He cited the specific line items in the infrastructure fund. He cited the dates. He noted that a copy of the complete documentation package had been provided to Abigail Stern of Nashville, who had submitted it the previous week to the Tennessee Comptroller's Office, the State Attorney General, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Nashville Field Office. He set a copy of the documentation on the table in front of the commissioners. Then he sat down. Gerald Voss's smile did not vanish. A smile like his did not vanish. It simply became something else over the course of a few seconds, as if the mechanism that controlled it had received a different instruction and was adapting. He said that the commission took all concerns about county processes seriously. He said procedures existed for exactly this kind of review. He said the hearing today was about the specific property matter before them, and he would ask that the commission remain focused on that matter. Loretta Hayes stood up. She was not using her cane today. She stood without it, and she looked at Gerald Voss across the room with the long, clear sight of a woman who has been watching people manage their reputations in public since before Gerald Voss was born. She said, "Gerald, your brother-in-law has been paid from county funds to survey land that he was simultaneously trying to acquire. That is in writing in this room, and it has been submitted to federal authorities. We can talk about focus all you want, but the whole room knows what we are looking at." The room was very quiet. Voss looked at the documentation on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. One of the other commissioners, a man on the far end named Patterson, who had not spoken at the previous hearing, leaned forward and said quietly that he thought the commission should table this entire proceeding, pending the completion of the state and federal reviews, and that he further thought the property in question should have its condemnation status suspended for the duration of those reviews. Given the questions now raised about the basis of the original condemnation, 2 other commissioners nodded. Voss said nothing. The vote was 4-1. The condemnation was suspended. The hearing was adjourned. Wade stood in the parking lot afterward in the cold blue morning and did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected something large, a release, the satisfaction of a thing concluded. What he felt instead was quieter than that. More like the feeling you get when you have been carrying something heavy for a long time, and you set it down, and your hands are empty and you are standing exactly where you were. Cole stood beside him. The boy looked at the courthouse building for a moment and then looked at the sky. He said, "Grandpa Earl spent 2 years trying to get someone to listen to him. Wade said he did. Cole said he knew they would not. Wade said he knew it was too big for the county level. He knew someone else would have to do it." Cole was quiet. Then he said, "He left us a box full of evidence and waited for the right person to come." Wade thought about the note on the deed. For Cole. When you are ready to come home. He thought about Earl Hargrove driving to Nashville in April 2012 and stopping first at the general store and leaving a box with Ruth and saying she would know who to give it to. A man who was losing everything had still been thinking ahead, had still been planning for a future he would not personally see from this land, had left in an old cardboard box in the back office of a general store, the instrument of everything that followed. Wade said he was a careful man. Cole said he was a Hargrove man. The February sun was moving over the courthouse roof, and the light came down at a low winter angle across the parking lot, the same low winter light that had been coming down over this valley since before the courthouse existed, since before any of the buildings on this street existed, since the first person who ever stood in this valley looked at the land and decided to stay. Wade thought about all the miles between Oakland and this parking lot, all the years, the weight of them and what they had cost and what they had produced, and whether the sum of a life could be measured by where it led when the engine finally gave out. He thought about Bobby Hargrove writing 3 careful pages before a mission he did not come back from, writing about the man who would find his way to the door, not knowing the man's name, not needing to. The cold air moved across the parking lot. Wade pulled his jacket closer and looked at Cole and said, "Come on. Seth will have the coffee on by the time we get back." They walked to the truck together, the gravel crunching under their boots in the February cold, and behind them the courthouse stood in its ordinary way, in the ordinary Tennessee morning holding its records and its judgments, and the slow partial work of justice finding its own time. Spring came to Wilson County the way spring comes to Tennessee. Not all at once, but in negotiations a warm week followed by cold, then warmth again, each warm spell lasting a little longer than the one before, until one morning in late March, you step outside and understand that the cold has finally lost the argument. The oak tree in the front yard showed it first. The buds came out in early March, small and tight, and then over the course of 2 weeks, they opened into the pale green of new leaves, and the tree that had spent the winter as a dark architecture of bare branches became something else entirely full and generous, throwing shade across the porch, the way it must have thrown shade across that porch for 60 years. Wade stood under it one morning with his coffee and looked up through the new leaves at the sky. He thought about who had planted that tree. The tree was older than the house, so Earl had not planted it. But someone had. Someone a long time ago had put a sapling in that ground and let it grow. And now it shaded a porch where a 62-year-old former Hells Angels enforcer stood drinking camp coffee in the Tennessee spring. The people who planted it were long gone. The tree did not care about any of that. It just kept growing. The investigation moved at the pace investigations moved, which was not fast, but it was visible. In March, 3 weeks after the February hearing, a notice appeared in the Wilson County Register that Commissioner Gerald Voss had voluntarily recused himself from all commission business pending the completion of an inquiry by the State Comptroller's Office. The notice was 12 lines long and said almost nothing directly. But what it said between the lines was that the inquiry was serious enough to warrant recusal, rather than risk the appearance of conflict. Abigail Stern called Pastor Ellis, who called Wade, who was on the roof of the barn, when Ruth came down the driveway to tell him. He came down the ladder and listened. He said very little. He thanked Ruth for coming down. Then he went back up the ladder and finished the section of roofing he had been working on. There was still work to do. The back taxes were the remaining formal obstacle, $15,000 in arrears going back to 2012. Wade had the money now, or close to it, through a combination of what Ruth had quietly organized through the church social fund and what Pastor Ellis had raised through 2 conversations with the Historical Preservation Committee of the county. The committee had designated the Hargrove farmhouse eligible for the County Register of Historic Places, a designation that carried a modest grant for preservation and, more importantly, created a legal complication for any future condemnation proceeding that would require a different level of review than a standard blight action. Cole's 18th birthday was still 2.5 years away, which meant the property remained in a legal gray space, technically in arrears and technically belonging to the estate of Earl Hargrove, with Cole as the identified heir. Abigail Stern had advised a specific approach. Clear the tax debt, now apply for a formal guardianship extension through the probate court that would allow Cole's interests to be legally protected until he reached majority, and file the historic designation paperwork before the end of spring. Each step closed a door behind them. Wade paid $7,000 of the back taxes from his own account. This was most of what he had. He did not mention it to Cole or to anyone else. Ruth found out because Ruth had a way of finding out things about her valley. And she came to the farmhouse one evening in April and sat across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him for a long moment. She did not say anything right away. She had learned over the winter to let silences be silences rather than filling them with the nearest available words. This was one of the things about her that Wade had come to value without quite finding language for it. Then she said, "You know you did not have to do that." He said he knew. She said, "You do not have anything left." He said, "I have everything I need." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said the Historical Preservation Fund had matched his contribution, and that the county social fund had covered the remainder, and that the tax debt had been formally cleared that morning at the county clerk's office. He said, "Good." She said, "Earl would have done the same for you." This stopped him. He sat with it for a moment and found that it was true in the way that things about a man you never met can be true when that man has left himself behind in a house with such thoroughness that you come to know him through what he built and what he saved, and the careful way he arranged evidence in a box for someone he could not have described. He said, "I know he would have." Ruth stayed for dinner. She had brought groceries from the store, the practical way she often expressed things that were not about groceries. They cooked at the kitchen counter together. A simple thing, pasta and a sauce made from the last of the canned tomatoes. And they ate at the table with the window dark and the spring peepers going outside in the wet ground beyond the garden. And it was an ordinary evening, and it was entirely sufficient. Seth had been at the farmhouse through March and into April. He worked on the barn's interior walls and helped Wade with the kitchen plumbing repair that had been waiting since February. And on 2 weekends, he drove to Nashville where Emma and Katie came to meet him at a park near Nora's apartment. He came back from those weekends quieter than he left. Not with the quiet of sadness, but with the quiet of a man who is slowly learning something difficult and knows it will take more than a weekend to learn it. He talked about Emma and Katie on the evenings he was willing to talk. He said Emma was 10 and very serious, the kind of child who asked questions that required actual thought to answer. He said Katie was 9 and had her mother's laugh and had decided Seth was acceptable based on the criterion that he had let her sit in the driver's seat of his truck. He said Nora had been generous in a way he had not earned and was trying to understand how to receive without reverting to the defensive pride that had cost him so much. Wade listened. He did not offer advice. He had no expertise in this area. What he had was the understanding that some things could only be learned by doing them badly first and then less badly, and that the willingness to continue after the badly was the actual work. Seth left in April. He left on a Tuesday morning, the sky clear, and the Harley running smooth after Wade had gone through it properly, replacing the valve and the head gasket and checking everything else while he had it open. Seth packed his bag, which had always been in the bedroom and not spread into the rest of the house the way some people's things spread, and he stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the house. He said, "I have been trying to figure out what I am supposed to do next." Wade said, "Did you figure it out?" Seth said he thought Emma and Katie needed their father more than they needed him to be a specific kind of person. He said he thought he could do the work of being present, even if he was not yet good at it. He said there was a construction company in Nashville run by a man who had served and who hired veterans, and who had told Seth the previous weekend that he had work available. He said, "I do not know if it is enough." Wade said, "It is a start. A start is what a start is." Seth looked at him for a moment. Then he extended his hand. Wade shook it, and in the handshake was the compressed acknowledgement of what had passed between them. The letter carried for 3 years. The January cold, the evenings in the barn, the things said and unsaid. Seth got on the motorcycle. He rode down the driveway and turned onto the road, and the sound of the engine moved south toward Nashville. And then the sound was gone and the valley was quiet except for the birds in the oak tree. Wade stood on the porch for a while after Seth left. He thought about the letter Seth had carried for 3 years. He thought about Bobby Hargrove pressing an envelope into a man's hands before a mission, and trusting that the envelope would find its way. He thought about the specific faith that required the faith of a man who believes that the world will do the right thing with what he leaves in it, even when the evidence for that belief is limited. Bobby had been right. The spring deepened into May and the garden became urgent. Ruth had started seedlings in the greenhouse in early March, working from the seed packets Wade had found in the shed. On his first morning, the ones stored in glass jars labeled in Agnes's handwriting. Most of them were still viable. Tomatoes and beans and sweet corn, and 3 kinds of squash, and a row of sunflowers whose seeds were the size of small coins. Ruth treated them with the care of things that had been waiting a long time and deserved to arrive. By May, the greenhouse was full, and the garden beds were being turned over for the first time in 3 years. Cole came on weekends and helped learning to read soil the way he had learned to read wood patiently, and with respect for what it knew that he did not. He had good instincts for it. Earl Hargrove's blood. Wade thought watching the boy work a row with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than instruction. The community came. This was not organized and it was not announced. It simply happened the way things happen in small valleys when word moves through them over the course of a winter. And the word is that something worth preserving is being preserved. Henderson from the adjacent property spent 2 Saturdays in May helping with fence line repair. A man named Garrett, who ran the hardware store in Millhaven, came with his son one Sunday and helped rehang the barn doors that had been sitting on their hinges wrong since before Wade arrived. Loretta Hayes came with her granddaughter and spent a morning in the greenhouse learning the seed history from Ruth, asking questions about Agnes Hargrove, with the interest of a woman who had known Agnes and wanted to honor the knowing. Pastor Ellis brought his whole Sunday school class one afternoon in early June. Teenagers who worked with varying competence and uniform goodwill on the stone pathways in the garden, resetting the frost-shifted stones back to level. Cole worked alongside them. Wade watched from the barn doorway and thought about what it meant that a 16-year-old boy was working on his great-great-grandfather's garden paths with 12 teenagers he did not know particularly well, and that all of them seemed to understand without being told that the work was worth doing. The summer arrived. The garden produced. The tomatoes came in by early August quantities that Earl and Agnes must have managed with the same cheerful abundance of people who grew things for the giving as much as the having. Ruth set up a table at the end of the driveway on Saturday mornings with whatever the week had produced, and people stopped and took what they wanted and left what they felt like, leaving money or vegetables from their own gardens or simply a conversation that lasted longer than a Saturday morning transaction needed to last. This was how Agnes Hargrove had done it, Ruth said. Good soil is meant to be shared. Cole turned 17 in July. Diane Hargrove came for the birthday. Cole's mother, a quiet woman in her mid-40s who had spent 4 years protecting her son from a grief she had not entirely survived herself, and who walked around the restored farmhouse with an expression that shifted between recognition and something harder to name, the expression of someone encountering evidence that the story she had told herself about a place might not have been the only story. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long time, looking at the calendar on the wall. April 2012. Wade had never taken it down after removing it from its nail that first week. He had put it back up. It seemed right that it should stay. Diane looked at the calendar and then looked at the kitchen. The repaired floor, the new window pane, the table that had held Earl Hargrove's meals for 40 years and now held theirs. She said to Wade, "He loves this place." Wade said, "He should. It is his." She said, "I thought it was too much for him. Too much history. Too much loss." Wade said, "It is all of that. And it is also just a house that needed work." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He did not know what to say to that. He said Earl did most of the work. We just showed up. The community gathering in August was Ruth's idea. She called it a preservation celebration, which was a practical name for something that was actually about more than preservation. It was about the thing that had happened to this valley over the past 10 months. The way a piece of land and the story inside it had become a point around which the community had organized itself. That happened rarely, and it was worth marking when it did. She set up long tables in the yard under the oak tree. The tree was at its fullest in August, enormous and generous throwing shade across the tables and the yard, and most of the front of the house. People brought food and chairs in their families, and they filled the yard in the August evening in the way that valleys fill when the people in them want to be in the same place at the same time. Loretta Hayes was there in her good dress. Henderson from the property line was there with his wife and 3 grown children. Pastor Ellis was there. The man Garrett from the hardware store was there with his son, who had gotten the barn doors right. A dozen other faces that Wade had come to know over the course of 10 months of small transactions and conversations over coffee and encounters in the driveway when someone came to see how the house was getting on. Ruth had put flowers from the garden on every table the sunflowers Agnes Hargrove had planted from seed in 1974, and every year since, until she could no longer grown this year from the seeds stored in the glass jar in the shed, enormous and yellow and turning toward the last of the evening light. The way sunflowers always turn following what gives them life. Wade stood near the barn and watched the yard fill and thought about Earl Hargrove's wedding photograph on the mantelpiece. The young man in the suit that did not quite fit his shoulders grinning at his luck. All of this had been built from that grin, from that young man's decision to put his life into this ground. The tables in the yard and the garden and the greenhouse and the tool shed with the tools hung in their proper order, and the house that had held and would keep holding. Cole found him near the barn at the edge of the gathering. The boy had been quiet most of the evening in the way he was quiet when something was working in him that he had not finished processing. He stood next to Wade and looked at the tables and the people and the sunflowers moving in the August evening breeze. He said, "I want to read the letter tonight." Wade looked at him. He said, "You do not have to." Cole said, "I know. I want to." He said he had been thinking about it since January. He said he had read it many times by now, enough times to know it the way you know something you have carried close. He said he thought the people in this yard deserved to hear what his father had written, because what his father had written was about this valley and the people in it and the kind of men it produced when it was at its best. He said he thought Earl Hargrove deserved to have his name spoken in this yard by someone who carried his blood. Wade said, "When you are ready." Cole said, "I am ready." He went to the center table and he did not ask for attention. He simply stood there with the envelope in his hands, and the yard gradually noticed him and went quiet. The way yards go quiet when something is about to be said that the people in them understand matters. He said his name. He said his father's name. He said his great-grandfather's name. He said, "My father wrote this in Afghanistan in March of 2012. He died the following April." He never saw this yard again. He never saw what became of this place. But I want to read you what he wrote, because I think he knew things he should not have been able to know from that far away. The August evening held still. The sunflowers stood in their vases on the long tables. The oak tree was very quiet. Cole unfolded the pages. He read. His voice was steady in the way of a person who has decided to be steady and has put everything they have into that decision. He read his father's words about Earl Hargrove and the grief of those years, and what Bobby understood about why the men in the family had found the grief impossible to stay inside of. He read what his father had written about leaving, about how leaving was not cowardice, but a kind of love that did not know how to express itself in stillness. He read the part about coming home, about the last tour, about the porch railing. "I'm coming home after this last tour. I will fix that porch railing myself." The yard was absolutely silent. Cole's voice was the only sound, and the evening light came through the oak leaves and fell across the white pages in his hands. Then Cole read the last section. He read what his father had written about the man who would come to the door. The man who would not look the way you expected a good man to look. The man with a past that did not recommend him. The man who would stay when staying was the harder choice, and fix things not because anyone asked, but because he could not stand to see them broken. The man who would be Bobby had written a Hargrove man in every way that mattered, whether he had Hargrove blood or not. Cole folded the pages. He looked at Wade. The whole yard looked at Wade. Wade stood near the barn with his hands at his sides, and he did not look away. He was 62 years old, and he had ridden east from Oakland with nothing, and had stopped in a driveway because his engine quit. He had slept on the floor of an abandoned house with a can of cold beans and $240. He had spent 30 years in the service of a brotherhood he had believed in, and that had ended with a 2-paragraph letter, and a man in Afghanistan who did not know his name had written a paragraph that described him. He did not speak. There was nothing to say, and he knew it. He stood in the August evening and let the moment be what it was, which was something he had not expected and could not have asked for, which was the simplest and most complete form of being seen. Loretta Hayes, sitting at the nearest table, looked at him with her long, clear eyes. She nodded once slightly, the nod of a woman who has been watching people for 72 years and knows when she is watching something true. Pastor Ellis said a few words. He spoke about Earl and Agnes Hargrove and what they had built on this ground, and what it meant that the ground was still here and still producing. He spoke about what communities owed to the people and places that gave them their history, and what those people and places gave back when they were tended. Then the yard was about food and conversation. Again, the way evenings become when the serious things have been said, and there is still daylight enough, and good company and no reason to rush. Wade stayed near the barn for a while. Ruth found him there later with 2 plates of food, and she handed him one and stood beside him, and they ate without talking and watched the yard. After a while, she said, "He was right about you." Wade said Bobby had never met me. She said, "No, but he had met his grandfather. And his grandfather made the house that made the yard, that made you want to stay and fix what was broken. Bobby knew because he had grown up with the man who would attract exactly that." Wade thought about this for a long time. He thought about the way certain things accumulated their true meaning over time. How the meaning of an act was often not available at the moment of the act, but arrived later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes only when someone else named it from the outside. Earl Hargrove had built a house and a garden and a greenhouse and a marriage and a family. Most of that was gone now, or scattered or stored in the memory of people growing old. But the house was still there. The garden was producing. The greenhouse had Agnes's sunflowers in it from her own seed. And the box of documents that Earl had assembled quietly over years, the box he had left in the general store for whoever would come, had brought a corrupt man's plan to the attention of people with the authority to do something about it. Earl Hargrove had not been able to save his own land, but he had left everything anyone would need to save it for him. Wade said he was a patient man. Ruth said, "The land teaches you that." The summer ended and September came in with the beauty of Tennessee in the early fall, the light going gold at the edges of everything, the air cooling at night while the days stayed warm, the garden in its final and most generous production. Cole came every weekend and sometimes on a Thursday evening too, and on those Thursday evenings he and Wade often just sat on the porch after dinner and watched the light change over the hills, and said very little, which had become its own kind of conversation over the months. In October, a letter came from Abigail Stern in Nashville. She wrote to say that the comptroller's investigation had concluded and that findings had been referred to the state attorney general's office, and that Dale Voss's preliminary development application had been formally withdrawn by the applicant, which in legal terms meant that the application had been abandoned before it could be denied. Gerald Voss had resigned from the county commission in September officially for personal reasons. The infrastructure fund audit had been completed, and 3 years of improper payments had been identified, and recovery proceedings had been initiated. The highway expansion project had been canceled entirely, not only in Wilson County, but along the entire proposed corridor due to a combination of environmental impact findings and the cloud of the ongoing investigations. Wade read the letter at the kitchen table. He thought about Earl Hargrove making phone calls in 2011 that led nowhere. The county attorney, the county assessor, the comptroller's regional office, writing down each response in his careful handwriting, the word nothing appearing in those notes like a recurring verdict. Earl had been right that the county was the wrong level. He had just needed someone to carry it to the right level. And the right person had taken 3 years to arrive. Wade folded the letter and put it in the drawer where he kept the important papers beside the copy of the deed and the note Earl had written for Cole and Cole's father's last letter, which Cole had left at the farmhouse with the specific intention that it should stay there with the other things that belonged to the house. November came. A year since Wade Briggs had pushed a broken Harley up this driveway in the October cold. He spent the anniversary the way he spent most mornings, standing at the back door with coffee, looking out at the garden in its late fall state. The beds cleared and covered, the greenhouse closed against the cold, the fence lines holding. He was 63 years old now. His birthday had passed in late October. With no ceremony, which was how he preferred it, Ruth had put a candle in a piece of cornbread at dinner, and Cole had shown up unexpectedly with a bottle of something from the liquor store in town. And that was the extent of it, and it was entirely enough. He stood at the back door in November and thought about where he had been a year ago today. The letter on the kitchen table in San Bernardino, the photographs coming off the wall, the Harley in the parking lot, and the white line disappearing under the front wheel. He thought about what he had been looking for on that road. He had not had language for it then. The road had just been the available option, the thing that a man in his particular situation did, because the alternative was staying somewhere that had finished being home. He had not been looking for this, but he thought about what Ruth had said in August about how Earl Hargrove had made the house that made the yard, that attracted the kind of man who would stay and fix what was broken. He thought about the way certain things were constructed over lifetimes to find the right people at the right moment, the way a man with the right knowledge could read a landscape and see water under the ground that was not visible on the surface. Earl had built something that found him. He did not know what to do with that theologically or philosophically. He was not a man much given to either. But he knew that it was true in the way practical things were true in the way a roof that held against rain was true. You could see the evidence of it. You could stand under it and stay dry. Cole turned 18 in July of the following summer. He had finished his junior year of high school with grades that would take him to Middle Tennessee State in the fall agricultural engineering, which was the right program for a boy who had learned to read both soil and wood and had inherited from a man he never met the temperament of someone who understood that the things you built with your hands were the things that lasted. Wade had written him a letter of recommendation at the request of the admissions department, which had asked for one from a community member who knew the applicant well. He had not told Cole he was writing it. Cole found out when the acceptance letter came. The birthday dinner was at the farmhouse. Diane Hargrove came. Ruth cooked. Loretta Hayes came and brought a pie, and stayed past 9 in the evening talking to Cole about Earl and Agnes, the stories she had been accumulating for 73 years, giving them to the one person who had the right to carry them forward. After Diane left and Loretta left and Ruth had gone home to her apartment above the store, Wade and Cole sat on the porch in the July dark, with the fireflies going in the yard below the oak tree and the summer sounds all around them. They sat for a while without talking. Then Cole said he needed to do something the next morning and that it would take most of the day. He said he would be back by late afternoon. Wade said, "All right." Cole said, "Do not go anywhere." Wade said he was not planning to. He spent the next morning the way he spent most mornings. He was working on the east wall of the barn when Cole's truck came up the driveway at 4 in the afternoon, the truck Cole had bought with his summer job. Money, a 10-year-old Ford that ran reliably and had enough bed space for lumber. He parked and got out, and he was carrying a small envelope, not his father's envelope. Something new, white business-sized with no writing on the outside. Wade came out of the barn. Cole held the envelope for a moment. He looked at the house the way a person looks at something they have come to a decision about over a long period of time. A decision that required the decision-maker to grow into it. He said, "I went to see Abigail Stern today. She helped me." He said, "This place legally becomes mine when I turn 18. Stern finished the probate transfer this morning. Earl's estate is closed. The title is clear." Wade said nothing. Cole said, "I had her add something to the title." He held out the envelope. Wade took it. He opened it with the same care he used on everything in this house, the care of someone who has learned that the things inside envelopes matter. Inside was a legal document, single page, and attached to it with a paperclip, a small brass key. The document was a deed transfer. Half interest in the Hargrove property, Wilson County, Tennessee, legal description following. Transferred to Wade Briggs. And beneath the legal language at the bottom of the page, written in Cole's handwriting in blue ink, the same ink his great-grandfather had used on a scrap of paper in a kitchen drawer. The same words in the same sequence, but addressed to a different man. For Wade. When you are ready to come home. Wade held the document. He stood in the driveway in the July afternoon with the barn behind him and the house in front of him, and the oak tree throwing its late afternoon shadow across the porch, and the garden visible through the side yard, and the greenhouse at the back, and the entire accumulated physical evidence of 4 generations of a family's devotion to this ground. He looked at Cole, the boy who was now 18 and stood with the steadiness of a person who has made a considered decision and is at peace with it. Looked back at him. Cole said, "My great-grandfather left that place for someone who was ready to come home. He meant my father. My father did not make it back. He said, I think he would be all right with where it ended up." Wade could not speak for a moment. He looked down at the key in his hand. A standard brass house key, ordinary in every material respect. He had held many things in these hands over 63 years. Things he was not proud of. Tools and hardware and the hammer from Earl's shed that had started all of this. He had held the documentation that brought down Gerald Voss. He had held cold beans eaten on the floor of a dark house on the worst night of his adult life. He had never held a piece of his own. He said, "Cole." Cole said, "I know." That was all. 2 words between them and the July afternoon and the oak tree, and 30 years of a life that had led by a series of failures and wrong turns, and a broken engine on a Tennessee highway exactly here. Wade pressed the heel of his hand against his eye for a moment, not hiding it, just holding it. Then he put the key in his pocket. He said, "Your grandfather built this place to last." Cole said he did. Wade said, "Let us make sure it does." They stood in the driveway in the July light for a moment more. Then Wade turned back toward the barn, and Cole followed him, and they went back to work on the east wall, which needed 3 more boards before the afternoon was done. And the light was good, and there was no reason to wait. The years that followed were not dramatic years. They were years of the kind of work that does not make for dramatic telling, but makes for a life. The garden produced, and the greenhouse produced, and the house stood solid through winter after winter, and the oak tree kept growing in the yard, because nothing had yet given it a reason to stop. Cole went to Middle Tennessee State in the fall, and came home most weekends, and in the summers worked the land with the seriousness of a student who understood that his classroom and his laboratory were the same place. He brought books home from the agricultural library and left them on the kitchen table. And Wade read them in the evenings the way he had never read anything in 30 years of writing slowly, and with the interest of someone who was learning something that mattered for practical reasons. Ruth was there most mornings. This had happened gradually and without announcement, the way the right things happen. And by the time it was simply the way things were, it had been that way long enough that no one thought to remark on it. Seth Pruitt called occasionally from Nashville. He had taken the construction job and was working steadily, and seeing Emma and Katie every other weekend and some school holidays. He said Emma had decided he was acceptable on the grounds that he showed up consistently, which he said was a fair standard, and one he intended to keep meeting. He said Katie had taught him to braid hair, which he said was harder than it looked. He said this without embarrassment, the way a man says something true. The farmhouse photographs accumulated. Wade did not take them, and did not ask Ruth to. Cole brought them when he came home from school prints from his phone that he had made into actual photographs at the drugstore in Millhaven. Wade on the roof, Ruth in the garden with Agnes's sunflowers, Cole with a measuring tape in his hand squinting into the sun. The new photographs went on the mantelpiece alongside Earl and Agnes's wedding portrait, and the family photographs that had watched over the room since before any of them arrived. On the evening of what would have been Earl Hargrove's 85th birthday, Wade sat on the front porch alone after dinner. The summer dark was coming down over the valley, the fireflies going in the yard, the oak tree massive and still against the darkening sky. He thought about the man who had built this place, the young man in the photograph, the suit that did not quite fit his shoulders grinning at his luck. 40 years of working this ground. Agnes in the garden in her wide-brimmed hat. Children on the tire swing. The greenhouse built on a Saturday. The tools hung in their proper order. The box of documents assembled quietly over years and left in the care of a woman who would know the right person when they came. He thought about the note. For Cole. When you are ready to come home. The thing about that note was that it was an act of faith. A man who had lost more than most men are asked to lose had still believed that the right person would come, and that the right person would know what to do with what they found. He had not been specific about who that person was. He had not needed to be. He had simply prepared the ground and trusted. Wade reached into his shirt pocket and took out the brass key. He turned it over in his hand, an ordinary brass key worn smooth at the bow from a year of being taken out and turned over and put back. He had never attached it to a keychain. He just carried it in his shirt pocket where he could reach it. He looked at it in the last light. 63 years old. Former enforcer for the Hells Angels Oakland chapter. 30 years of doing things he would not be proud of in rooms he would not describe. One broken engine on a Tennessee highway. One driveway. One abandoned house with an oak tree in the yard, and a family's whole history inside it. He put the key back in his pocket. He could hear Ruth in the kitchen. the sound of dishes, the radio low. Cole was coming home this weekend back from his second year at Middle Tennessee State and had mentioned he was bringing someone he wanted them to meet, a girl from his program named Anna, who had grown up on a farm in Kentucky and who Cole said understood about land, in the way you only understood it when you had grown up working it. Another generation, another person finding their way to this porch. Earl Hargrove had not lived to see how far his work would eventually reach. That was how it worked with the things you built when you built them well. You did not get to know the full extent of what you had started. You just started it and tended it and trusted. Wade looked out at the valley going dark below the hills. The lights of Millhaven visible in the south, small and warm against the night. The way small towns look from a distance when it is evening, and the people in them are inside with their families, and the lights in the windows are the yellow of lived-in rooms. He had spent 30 years riding past lights like that, passing through towns that were not his, eating at counters where the coffee came without being asked and nobody knew his name, and that was fine, because he had not needed them to. He was not passing through anymore. The screen door opened behind him, and Ruth came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the chair beside him without asking, and set 1 cup on the arm of his chair. The porch was level under them, and the boards did not shift when she sat. They had been replaced, and they held. The fireflies moved through the yard below the oak tree. The valley was quiet. The house was behind them, solid and warm, its windows lit from inside. Wade picked up his coffee. He had been a man who burned through things his whole life. Oil and asphalt, and the fuel of belonging to something that asked you to be hard and keep moving. He had burned through 30 years of brotherhood and come out the other end with a duffel bag and $240 and a broken engine. He was sitting on a porch that he had repaired with his own hands, beside a woman who had put flowers from a dead woman's garden seeds on tables in this yard, looking at land that partly bore his name in a county clerk's file in a courthouse 3 miles down the road. The October air moved through the oak tree above the porch, and the leaves turned a few of them, letting go, spiraling down through the porch light and settling on the boards at his feet. Rust-colored and ordinary and exactly right.